the circumstances under which this demographic change happened in the Western countries took very long period of time, almost 2 centuries. On the other hand, if you compare how the demographic change happened in the developing nation, let's take case of Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka has also been is a part of developing countries and has a very long demographic data. So it allows us to see how the process of population change has actually happened in some of the developing countries. Now, if you see in the case of Sri Lanka, we see that there are clear-cut parallels that one can draw in the beginning of the 20th century in Sri Lanka. The level of mortality and fertility was very high. Roughly 35 per thousand population was the birth rate, and close to 30 was the level of the death rate. And so therefore net increase in the number or the size of population was very small. And then after 1920 onwards, we see that there is a declining trend in the death rates, and particularly after Second World War, there is a very rapid decline in the death rates. So post Second World War, we know that there was massive expansion of public health services and vaccinations. So with access to better health care, the death rate in these countries started to come down. On the other hand, the birth rates remained high and stagnant. So therefore we can clearly see that there is a spike in the population increase between 1920 to 1950, and that is the period during which mortality was declining rapidly, birth rates were higher, so there was a rapid jump in the population number in Sri Lanka. And then after 1970s or late 1960s, we see that birth rates also starts to fall on a gradual basis, consistent basis. And now during 1995 and close to 2000, we see that birth and death rates also achieve fairly lower level. So if we try to contrast the journey of Sweden, one of the countries from developed part of the world, and Sri Lanka, one of the countries from developing part of this world, what parallels can we draw? I mean, one of the significant parallel is that the time which it took for Sweden, almost 200 years. On the other hand, if you see the case of Sri Lanka, this was fairly quick, around 60 to 70 years. And part of the reason is that this was propelled through implication of a Second World War, rapid increase in medical facilities, due to Green Revolution, better supply of food and food securities. All this led to, decline in death rates, and then after a generation, decline in birth rates. So if you compare the implication of demographic changes in the global north versus global south, there can be some similarities. But one common thing that I want to underline is that most of the countries in the world which experience population change, this process started with mortality decline. Irrespective of the fact whether because Sri Lanka did not have the level of industrial progression or economic growth or level of urbanization that some of the Western countries did experience. In fact, many of the developing countries which have actually experienced demographic change without actually undergoing a lot of changes in their economic and social circumstances, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it is Pakistan, South Asia, East Asia, many of these countries underwent demographic transition at fairly lower level of development status. So, this is an important point that I want to highlight. Another fascinating point when we were to compare the population changes between these countries is if we look at the age pyramid or population pyramid of these countries. So the top panel on the left is of course Sweden, and the top panel on the right is Sri Lanka. The bottom panels, so the top panel is basically in the beginning of the demographic change, and the bottom panel is when they are almost completed their demographic change. So you can clearly see the difference In the top panel, majority of the population are accrued in the younger age group. Almost 40 to 50% of population was less than 25 years of age when this transition actually began. On the other hand, when transition completes, we observe that majority of people are more than 40 to 45 years and above, and the share of children and young population declines. And here lies the important process which we also call as population momentum. Often we find that when fertility levels have come down and mortality levels have come down, we still find that in several parts of the world the population continues to increase. And the reason being is that, of course, the number of births in the population may have come down because of lower fertility levels, but due to the fact that still a large share of people, particularly women who are in the reproductive age group, are there, so they will continue to have children. So since as long as there are people who are in the reproductive age categories in the population will continue to increase, of course at relatively lower pace because of lower fertility levels. On the right hand side, the lower right hand side is Sri Lanka, and there also we find that there are relatively smaller share of people who are children or young people, and if you find people who are 40 plus, their share is rising. So there is a very different sort of population pyramid that is associated with societies which have already achieved population change and actually are now facing the challenges which are related with longer lives, higher life expectancies. Then if people are living longer lives, important challenge is what quality of life these people are actually living. On the one hand, one should celebrate the completion of demographic transition, but there are different set of challenges that are presented before any nation or society given these different population pyramid situation. So if you are a country, for example, even in Asia, countries which are still lagging behind in development outcomes, for example Afghanistan, or many countries in sub-Saharan Africa which are at their initial phases of population changes, they are facing a very different situation. Higher fertility, higher mortality, population age structure is very young. So the implication for development policies and planning are very different as compared to countries like Japan or Germany, or in fact several Indian states in the southern part of India where fertility is way below replacement level of 2.1. So the implications is that when population life expectancies has increased, which means that the longevity of population is rising, then there are important challenges related with the health services provision, social security provision, and of course the issues of scarcity of labor force supply. So all this mix are related with in what situation a particular country's populations find itself. And if we were to understand the process of population change at the global level, ultimately it may be zeroed down into demographic change is nothing but a set of transition that begins with mortality transition, wherein gradually there is a decline in mortality thanks to improvement in standard of living and the education, science, food supply, access to medical services, etc. These of course leads to the process of fertility transition to set in, wherein with mortality declining and increasing survivability of infants and kids adding into the population pyramid, there is a huge stress on the household budget of any family. And if you add all these families at societal level, it means that the families and society needs to plan birth in order to adjust this increased pressure on the household and society's budgets. So what happens that people tend to plan, regulate, space births. So because of these mortality and fertility transition, the next important transition is the age transition. What is happening is that in the beginning of this population change, there is a large, you have a typical pyramid, basically large number of people who are children or young people. And as the population, transition unfolds, gradually mortality declines, then these young infants and children moves up into the population pyramid, and there is a stage which we call as demographic dividend, wherein large share of people find themselves in age categories where they are considered as net producers, provided if they are properly educated, skilled, healthy, then they can contribute to economic growth if the macroeconomic situation of the country is congenial. And afterwards, this transitory phase of roughly 30 to 40 years, when that is over and these people enter into the age bracket of 60 plus, then the population is presented with the issues of healthy aging, productive aging, feminization of aging, what quality of life that elderly people are likely to live. Plus there are also issues of social securities, healthcare expenditure. All these kinds of challenges are presented, and of course the issues of economic sustainability. With age transition that is of course unfolding, we have this process of migration transition. Now what is happening is that age transition means that there are greater young people who are living in the rural areas, but given that the opportunity of livelihood being limited in the rural areas, these increased number of young people now need to move to other places to find better economic opportunities, which leads to the process of urbanization, wherein young people from rural areas, in order to look for better opportunities for their education, job, security and well-being, move from rural to urban areas, and therefore this process of urbanization sets in. And finally, this leads to the ultimate situation of family and household transition. When this demographic transition is complete, we find different forms of families, different living arrangement, different sets of meanings and understanding of values. Because in traditional societies, we often find a living arrangement which is joint family system, wherein relationships are very different. On the other hand, when you look at societies which has completed their demographic transition and now actually become a society which is post industrial, technical, lot of technologies and urbanized, what happened is that there is a preponderance of nuclear families over joint family system, because the cost of living etc. is very high, and therefore families in urban areas tend to become more nuclear. So there is a very different situation in terms of families, in terms of households, and also roles and responsibilities. Many times people do not enter into marriages, issues of cohabitations, issues of people not having children, people not marrying. So there are different sort of such vital events which happen. So it's a very different situation that presents itself after the process of this transition is over. Now if we have to see that in terms of numbers, like how the world population has actually changed in the last say for example 200 years. So it's very fascinating to note that the first billion population was actually observed in 1804. So from 1804 to the next second billion was added to the world population in 1927. So the first billion mark 1804, second billion 1927, roughly 123 years. The third billion mark was actually achieved in 1960, only 33 years. Then the next fourth billion in 1974. Today we are close to 8 billion. So less than 10 to 12 years we add 1 billion people to the world's population. And by the projection of the United Nations, by the end of this century, we expect to have about 11 billion people living on this planet. And of course we know that the rate of population growth is coming down, but yet the population growth is happening because of the issue of population momentum, which I discussed very recently. Now what is happening? The most fascinating part is that this growing population is not growing everywhere, and the age pattern of growth of this global population is also very interesting. I think it's very important for us to understand this point, that majority of this global population increase is actually happening in the developing world, mostly coming from Africa and Asia. Most of these countries are grappling to provide basic quality of life to its citizens, whether it is alleviating the issues of poverty and hunger, good quality education, better health, good livelihood opportunities. All these basic issues of development are the basic challenge which these countries are facing, and these challenges are being compounded number of times because of rapid increase in the population. On the other hand, we also note that the number of countries in the global north is actually facing the problem of negative population growth. Plus, they are also facing the problem of rising population aging. So, if you look at, well, of course, global population is rising, but where it is rising and what sort of population age group is increasing, that's very fascinating because implications are different. In the global south, where fertility levels are still quite high, the issues of youth, adolescent, children are very critical. Investing into human capital is the biggest challenge. On the other hand, if you compare situation in most of the global north, Western European, American, Oceanic countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, Singapore. So most of these countries are facing the problem of, labor scarcity, population aging, how to keep elderly active, productive, healthy, happy, engaging with society, how to take care of social security of elderly population, and how to keep economy afloat on a sustainable basis. So these are some of the important trends and implications that are related with population change that we are witnessing in the society today. And these are all outcomes of the modern demographic situation. I think it's also important for us to understand what future owes for us. So if according to United Nations World Population Division, from 2020 to 2050, if you were to understand what is basically going to contribute to the global population increase, so majority of the world's population is going to increase in the next 30 years due to population momentum. So basically this means that young people, mostly those who are living in the developing countries, they will continue to have children, of course, at lower rates. But as long as there are people who are in the reproductive age group, the population is likely to increase. However, if you were to piece out the situation across different world regions, we find that in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, majority of the population increase is actually going to happen because of higher fertility levels. On the other hand, if you compare Western European countries, Japan, Oceanic countries, most of these countries are going to face situation of negative population change, and their population is going to be adjusted due to migration. So the issues of skilled migration, opportunities, most of these Western countries have a regulated migration policies wherein they provide restricted number of visas of different categories in terms of the skill set which they need in order to ensure the development of economy and their respective society. So the population in the Western countries is actually going to go down, and some part of that it will be adjusted with restricted migration, inflow of international migration in those countries. However, in most of part of the low and middle income countries, majority of the population increase is either due to higher fertility, particularly in Africa, or because of population momentum. For example, in most of these Eastern Asian countries or South Asian countries. I think this is also very fascinating when we are looking at the global population change and how that is linked with the environmental sustainability. Now, this graph, if you can notice, basically tells you on the x-axis that over time how the per capita emissions of CO2 varies between different countries, and most importantly, if you look at the upper portion of this curve, it tells you that the per capita emissions of CO2 has tremendously increased in the Western countries. So the point that I want to draw home is this, that of course the population share of the developed countries has remained stagnated or is coming down, yet the emissions per capita CO2 is rising, which is a biggest threat for sustainability to this planet, one of the biggest threat. On the other hand, if you look at developing countries in the lowest panel of this line graph, probably shown in the green color, the net contribution of CO2 emissions by the low and middle income country has remained mostly unchanged in the last 50 or 60 years, irrespective of the fact that they are experiencing rapid population increase. So the point I want to draw home here is this, that of course in the developing countries where rapid population is rising, majority of people do not have enough to meet their basic needs of food, of energy, of shelter, of clothing, of educating, healthcare, basic facilities of consumption, production, etc. So the net contribution to CO2 or greenhouse gases is fairly insignificant. On the other hand, disproportionately high per capita CO2 emissions are coming from the developed world. That needs to be adjusted. And so therefore we all know about number of climate change negotiation and various United Nations committee of program which are happening in the last several years. They are planning how we can move towards adaptation, climate change mitigation, how we can minimize loss and damages. So for that reason, given the Western countries' greater contribution towards climate change and its impacts, which are going to be dire for everyone but disproportionately for people who are living in the global south, majority of whom have actually no role to play in most of these emissions. In fact, some of the small island states, countries have literally no role to play, but they are the worst hit due to global warming and rising of the sea levels. So this actually brings us to understand the major implications of the global population change. The first is, of course, as these global population change happening, it has direct bearing upon the family size and living arrangement. So what is happening that as society become modern, become more urbanized, more secular, so the reason, the implication is that there are gradually smaller nuclear families which have become more common today, and there are implications. The implication is about you have greater gender equities where both men and women are bearing responsibilities within household and outside, and fertility levels have become very low, and issues of course taking care of children and elderly are both significant challenges in this situation. There are also implications on understanding issues of society. So what is happening to society? Society has become more complex. Roles and responsibility have become very fluid, and so therefore it's very important for us to have a regular data collection, analysis, using big data, advanced methodologies, AI, etc., to understand how society's tastes, preferences and behaviors are changing because of due to population change. And of course we have to also think about understanding the economic implication of demographic changes. The reason being is that most of the developing countries now are entering into the era of demographic dividend, which is a transitory phase. So in order to materialize this transitory phase, it's very important for most of these developing nations to invest timely manner into education, skill building, and that will allow, of course, protecting health and nutrition of the young children, so that when they grow up as an adult, they would have a requisite skill set to contribute towards better economic and social progress of the society. And finally, the implication is towards strengthening the democracy, because at the end of the day, if you look at the sustainable development pillars, is of course economic, social and environmental. However, they can only deliver us results if they are supported with strong institutions. So as societies are modernizing and undergoing population changes, we mostly see that the democratic setup in these countries are strengthened, and they are able to deliver results for everyone. So whether if you look at one of the important slogans of SDGs, leaving no one behind. So this can only happen, in societies which are undergoing demographic changes, if we have policies and program that looks after each and every section of population, whether it is infants, they are children, they are adolescents, they are youth, they are adults, or they are elderly. And of course you have to also think about where these people are living. They may be living in villages, they may be living in smaller cities or town, or bigger cities or metropolitan cities. So therefore, considering the diversity of the geographic location of these population where they are living, the implications and related policies needs to be chalked out. That will only ensure the smooth demographic change and development outcomes for any nation or any state. Thank you so much.